To take your seats. I now have the pleasure of introducing Brian Larkin, whose book on media, infrastructure and technology in Nigeria introduced me to the idea of spasm as it relates to Nollywood film. And I also had the pleasure of teaching some of his writings in my African Cities class, where GSAPP students were able to access the complexity of Nigeria's cultural and political landscape through the medium of Nollywood. So it's with great pleasure that I get to introduce Brian Larkin as the moderator for our discussion on social infrastructure. Professor Brian Larkin is a Tau Associate Professor of Anthropology at Barnard College at Columbia University. He has written on issues of media technologies, their materiality, breakdown, and failure, the relation between media and urban space, infrastructure, piracy, and intellectual property, and on the circulation of cultural forms. His current work examines the interaction between media and religious practice, and he is completing a manuscript, Secular Machines, Media and Materiality of Islamic Revival in Nigeria. He is a board member of the Institute of African Studies and the Buell Center for American Architecture at Columbia University, and is a member there of the Committee in Global Thought. He sits on the editorial board of the journal Africa and is a member of the Social Text Editorial Collective. And I also think it's important to mention that later on this month, he's also organizing a conference on Nollywood at Columbia. So please join me in welcoming Brian Larkin.
Thank you, Info. It's great to be here. So to go quickly, the interest in infrastructure in African urbanism is governed partly by the effort to bring into visibility these systems that order everyday life. These are the technical, physical systems, the roads, the sewers, the pipes, the invisible structures that order and delimit the way we live urban life. But at the same time, and this panel is governed around the idea of social infrastructure, different forms, non-material forms, if we want to think of it in these ways. And so alongside the hard physical, technical systems of infrastructure, we have different sorts of social infrastructures. This brings back in ideas of cultural practice, ideas of desire, ideas of other sorts of engagement beyond simply the technical. So, we have telegraphs, roads, pipes, sea routes, fiber optic cables, and all the goods that they move. But infrastructures are important because they allow goods to move. They allow water to flow, people to move, commodities to traffic. But at the same time, there are soft infrastructures, forms of language, cultural practice, styles of dress, modes of deportment, the sort of sensibilities that also govern how flow takes place. And urban Africa in particular, not just urban Africa, but particularly urban Africa, are crucial sites for these sorts of cultural and social infrastructures. So, in this sense, exchange can only occur if individuals master the competencies necessary to participate in networks. Now, these can be different sorts of networks. If you're a Senegalese hip-hop star, you have to stand a certain way. You have to master a body, a practical mastery of how to spit rhymes. You have to dress a certain way. You have to present you in a way that you're recognizable to other people in that network. If you're a Senegalese Sufi sheikh, those modes of ritual, those modes of deportment or dress have to be different. You have to invest in these. They become what Marcel Mauss refers to as a manual knack, something you do again and again and again, so that it recedes below consciousness to something that you just reproduce. And once you do reproduce that, it allows you to participate in different forms of networks. So to give an example of this, Chinua Achebe, who when he went to England, went at the height of plain English, of Auden, of Larkin, of writing in clear, plain, understandable English. And this was the height of a certain clean modernity that Achebe adopted. He uses his prose, and then his characters like Obi Okonkwo in No Longer at Ease masters this narrative. And in No Longer at Ease, Achebe contrasts this plain language with local Nigerian language. It's baroque, it's verbose, it fits in the mouth, he says. It's like dry meat, you keep chewing over it. It's not plain and transparent. And so there's a one point when Obi Okonkwo, who is at this point the icon of a certain Weberian modernity, you become educated, you improve yourself by virtue of your own efforts in the world, and he goes for a job in the colonial civil service. And the examination there is not about his competency, it's not about his skills, it becomes a discussion of the modern novel that he has with the white colonialist who's interviewing him. And when Okonkwo gets the job, he gets the job because of his mastery of a certain cultural competence. There's a recognition that these two speak the same language, they read the same texts, they dress the same way, they participate in the same cultural networks. And that social infrastructure now allows a certain economic transaction to take place. And it's that transvaluation of one into the other that it can become an interesting dynamic. So this idea of how we understand this relationship between the cultural and the physical, I think is at stake when we think of infrastructures. It's not just the hardcore technical systems, but these other sorts of cultural competencies. And just the other week, African Studies and Zoe Struther in Art History organized a conference here on biennial cultures in African art. These become the infrastructural means, the gateways, where a certain social network is reproduced, where a certain habitus is enacted. You know, to get into, say, an African film festival, if you're an African art filmmaker, you must use a film language that is recognizable to those judges and juries. You have to leave behind a different sort of film language. You have to be educated in certain traditions. You have to be performative in that way. And things like film festivals, biennials, these are the gatekeeping infrastructural modes whereby certain cultural forces are made, are realized in contemporary Africa. And so part of what the social infrastructure idea does is return us to the idea that when we think of urban space, it's not just the physical emplacement of space. It's the way that the forms of culture that get enacted there. Your ability to speak French in a certain culture, or speak English, or speak Arabic, depending on what network you're involved in. These allow the moves, the flows of finance, the flows of people, the connection to other sorts of groups, and forms of ritual mastery, forms of linguistic competence, modes of dress, all become crucial to that idea. So I can say fairly confidently that maybe none of the papers today will address any of those issues. Though, at the beginning when I thought this is what it was about. However, all three of the people presenting are absolutely involved in producing these sorts of cultural networks themselves. All three of them are involved in founding different forms of journals, of blogs, of collectives that create the infrastructure of a certain sort of flow. This is a weak transition of my comments to the paper, but there you go. And so, with that in mind, what I'm interested in then is bringing these sorts of questions into relief. We have papers speaking today about photography, about climate change, about new forms of social media. They may congeal together, they may go in different directions. But I think what's interesting is the point of view from which they're coming. So we have three speakers. One, Tatiana Hori is an architect and designer. She's also involved as a founding collective member of, I don't know how to pronounce it, is it Shoe Collective, which brings together African professionals engaged around these issues of design, around urbanism, around environment and climate change. Again, it's a new sort of forum where different critical ideas about African urbanism is being produced. Sean Jacobs is an associate professor at the New School in the graduate program of International Affairs. He's also the founder of the blog Africa is a Country, which I'm sure most people in this room know about. It's one of the most important vehicles now for a certain sort of cultural and political debate that takes place around Africa, both in and out of the continent. And then Akin Adesokan is an associate professor of comparative literature at Indiana University. Akin is one of the interesting people from my point of view and my interest who writes on African film and also writes on popular African cinema as well. It tends to be that scholars break down and examining one or other side of those dimensions, but he's never given up on either of them. And he then plows a sort of singular furrow of developing a new sort of cultural discourse around forms of post-colonial art and aesthetics in contemporary Africa. So without further ado, Patty, do you want to come up?
Thank you very much to the organizers for having me here. It's quite a privilege to be back in New York and to be speaking of a very specific context, Cabo Verde, where I'm from and where I returned to 7 years ago after 25 years in the United States. I will not be presenting a paper per se. I don't know if I'll answer your provocations, but I'll be taking you on a very personal journey in some ways and talking a little bit about what happened when I returned to Cabo Verde and what my decisions have been to be an active participant in this discussion. I will also take you to people, stories of people. People make our cities through their daily practices, through their imaginaries, through their desires, and this is something that I have wanted to engage in my work. So I'm going to go very briefly. I know we have a very short time and I don't want to be cut, so I'll give, for those of you who don't, okay, here we go. For those of you who don't know Cabo Verde, I'll give a speed in numbers, Cabo Verde in numbers. It's a very small country of 500,000. We are a country of the diaspora, so our territoriality is not defined by our territory islands, but by a larger, much wider cultural nation or sense of nationhood. So there's some numbers. Cabo Verde is also seen in the official narratives as one of the success stories in Africa. So it's very successful in all the indexes, but we know that numbers do not tell the whole story. And it also inspired the name of one of the collectives and one of the projects that I have, which is called Ungrounding Narratives, which is going to shake a little bit the narratives, the official narratives that surround us. So I'll be speaking very briefly from a particular point of view of a work that I'm doing with former gang members in the city of Praia who have occupied a space in the city. But this is just to give you some visual references. The city of Praia has about 131,000 people, very small. But it has the same dynamics that we see in our growing cities of greater segregation, models of development that are not connected to our needs, and so on and so forth. So, and it's estimated that 70% of the population is engaged in processes of auto-construction, and you'll see that in one of the documentaries. So this is the most common way that our cities grow, and here's the question of who builds our cities and what does it mean to theorize our cities when the majority of the population is building their own place in the city through daily processes and also through their desires and imagination. So this is just a quick overview for those who don't know Cabo Verde. A lot of you have been there, or a few of you in the audience. From very rural landscapes, mountainous, to very dense urban conditions, to imported models from the diaspora of residences, to some so-called shanty towns, and this not so clear distinction between rural and urban, where you see in a very urban setting cows grazing. So this is the typical condition of a rapid urban growth, mass tourism, which has been the major economic impulse of the country, of course the neoliberal economic models, and then now what? We have a tourism, mass tourism, which creates a lot of contrasting landscapes. This is a photo montage that I made, but it talks about some of this contrasting landscapes that are occurring in such a small place. And those two spaces are within 4 kilometers from each other. And in our city, other narratives and other imaginaries of what is development and what it is that we want for our cities, as you can see in the renderings above and in our real city and how it's being constructed daily in the bottom. So now I will go specifically to present to you a strategy that I'm engaged with. When I returned to Cape Verde 7 years ago, I was invited to start a research center at a public university. And for 4 years, I tried to implement a research center dealing with urban issues and settlement. And it was quite a challenge because, and this is something perhaps we could discuss later, who funds research and how is research funded and how is knowledge created in a country that cannot afford to have even this kind of discussion. So we are speaking in a very privileged space right now and right here at this particular moment, and we have to be aware of that. And creating research and producing knowledge in a context where I, for example, had no budget to work with is very challenging. But yet I left voluntarily and decided to experiment with other forms of contributing to this discussion and started a couple of collectives, and this is what I'll speak about now. Oh my God, I went halfway already. So now I'll go into the website. How can I go to the website? Okay, no, that's not the one, the next one. Can somebody help me? Okay, thank you. There's going to be sound, noise, and people in this presentation. So about 1.5 years ago, myself and a filmmaker decided that we needed to do something about our city, especially since we started noting that it's becoming more and more segregated. It's a very small, as you can see, the radius is no more than 4 kilometers from the center to its current edge. Yet we're involved in a lot of narratives of a dangerous city. The majority of the population is considered, that form of creating cities considered informal and problematic and dangerous. So we decided that we were going to join forces and create a platform of interactive web documentaries, joining film narrative and social spatial analysis to talk about our city. So we were invited to work with a community in the city of Praia, with former gang members who occupied a particular building in their neighborhood and turned it into a community center. And they're a very active community activists. And that relationship has been going on for 1.5 years, of course, to get into their spaces, into their private stories, and to tell their story about what it is that to take on their space. I don't know how to enter here. It's important. It's in Creole actually, so I apologize. We had subtitles which did not get done in time. This is a work in process. And what we want to do is we want to create a platform that promotes a certain collaboration within our city for different artists, architects, sociologists to participate in telling this story and in the urgency of telling it. So we're engaging in this type of media to help us tell these stories more rapidly. So I'll go through a few of them, but not completely, just to show you how it works. It's an interactive web doc, meaning that you could enter and exit at any time. It's not a continuous narrative. It's a multimedia, etc. So we worked with this community that, like as I mentioned, a group of young men occupied it. They had occupied it earlier in the year 2000, and that was their headquarters for gang activity in the city. And then quite a few years later, a lot of them went to jail and came back and transformed this space into a community center where they work with mostly children. So in this one particular short narrative, we work with children, and the way we work is we have activities that we develop with the children, and then we put together their stories and project them here. So this is a story about a group of children who who take us around their neighborhood. So it's also a way of valuing their spaces and talking about how they experience and what they aspire for their spaces. I'll just go a little bit further here. And this is a project that we collaborated, obviously this is on a volunteer basis. We collaborated with 2 other artists, visual artists and a sociologist who helped frame these questions also, in addition to the social spatial analysis that are done. The platform has interfaces that you can click on and go to particular stories. And also it has a potential of linking to Google Map, to also serve as an archive for papers related to this neighborhood or these issues. So I will just walk you through briefly. And this is very much about the community also wanting to have a voice and show their stories, because I'll show a map in the next interface, but the proximities are very small between this woman's house and a proposed casino, a $250 million casino project is half a kilometer. So you start seeing that these proximities are oops, I'm running out of time and don't know what to say now. So anyway, so I'll just run through a few, and I'll invite you to please experiment with it. This is the casino that we're talking about over here, and it's a Chinese development that's underway. They've already started construction. And these are the distances, and the star is where we are in this neighborhood that we're talking about. And I'll talk a little very briefly about another project that was done by the Shu Collective, myself, another architect, and a transmedia designer in Cabo Verde, where we're talking about the issue of climate change, construction, and linking it, all these issues to the rapid urban growth and also to the models of development that are being undertaken in the city and over time. So I'll just invite you again to please visit. I have a few of these DVDs that I could give out, and it's also online. So we talk about the issue of tourism, which is one of the most poignant ones visually, to see this contrast, and it's an interactive media. So you could click here and you could see how chunks of our island, of big areas of the island, are being taken over and occupied with these all-inclusive tourism projects. And these are also some yeah, euros. No, it's interesting. It's of course much more complex because we have, in 9 islands, we have 4 international airports that receive tourists on a daily basis, and now we're going to have a casino a half a kilometer away from a neighborhood that's considered problematic, yet it's so full of life and interesting aspirations. So I'm over time, so I'll leave it here. I didn't get to say half of what I wanted to, but I invite you to please visit these sites. Thank you very much.
So I wrote mine down so I can stay with the time. So thanks, Paul, for inviting me, and I hope I can make some useful contribution. So my comments here come from a growing interest in interrogating Africa and Africans' place in what passes for the global public sphere, and in trying to map what kind of online media infrastructure is emerging. So these include, like, new circuits of information, new kinds of hierarchies that emerge online, whether some of the same inequalities over information and access to information are reproduced online, that there is a fluid relation between the diaspora and what is home, and the attendant discourses about the Africa Rising or Afropolitans, which are then reproduced not just in places like New York or Paris, but then also filter back onto the African continent. So what is obvious as far as the relationship between the idea of a global public sphere as far as social media is concerned is when it comes to Africa is that the generalizations hide a far more interesting set of relations and subjects that are often assumed. And I may also add that African elites and publics are as much implicated in these processes. Secondly, one other point I want to make is that we can identify a range of instances when it comes to Africans' participation in the global public sphere in which one, social media is able to thrive without representing a significant threat to the status quo in sub-Saharan Africa, just as there are a number of scenarios in which media act to represent real opportunities for political change or expression or representation. First, the obvious thing about this global public sphere. The most significant event in the recent and short history of Africa's place in the global online public sphere has to be Kony 2012. Despite criticisms about the 29-minute film around which the campaign pivoted, as well as that of Invisible Children, the organization behind it, that interventions like Kony 2012 will, at least for now, remain the dominant template for how the global public sphere, and by this I mean the West, will still engage with African issues and Africans. Having said that, while the West's worldview, which stems from a long-standing global hegemony, is so self-centered, and that self-importance leads them to condescending attitudes and acontextual attitudes towards non-Western contexts, this is not very surprising or very interesting, so I'm not going to spend my time here telling you how bad the West is. What is more interesting, I think, is how Africans have taken control of their representations and engage in the global public sphere. Like everywhere else, the result is equally complicated and subject to class, gender, location, mobility, and their access to the West, or in the way that they engage with Western discourses or adapt to it. So aside from Kony 2012 and projects like it, a number of actors and actions present interesting possibilities for how Africans interact with social media and the kind of infrastructures that they create there. The first, surprisingly, is the effort of African governments and government leaders. Though in general, African heads of state back away from social media, or at best get their staff to tweet or post on Facebook on their behalf, there are exceptions, and I just want to mention a few. The first was Nigeria's former President Goodluck Jonathan, who was an early adopter of social media. For example, he launched his presidential run on Facebook in 2011, but by January 2012, he had set a world record, and it's unclear who made this. This kind of, it's like a domino effect where everybody starts repeating it, as the most cursed president on Facebook, and became the subject of biting memes. One example was the hashtag #GEJPose, where ordinary Nigerians posted selfies to parody Jonathan's awkward, and as one of my colleagues described it on Africa as a Country, deeply concerned chin-stroking posts when he was visiting victims of Boko Haram's terror. Instead of inspiring confidence, the post reflected Jonathan's and the Nigerian state's inability to protect its citizens. And by the end of his term, Jonathan had withdrawn completely from social media. Then there's Rwanda's longtime president, Paul Kagame, who until recently best illustrated the potential and the paradox of social media for African politics and its political leaders. Kagame had been dubbed the digital president by the ITU's Broadband Commission for his efforts to get Rwandans wired. More interestingly has been Kagame's actions on Twitter. Kagame has the most Twitter followers of any African head of state and compares favorably with his Euro-American counterparts. There are 4 things about Kagame's Twitter habits that make him stand out. First, until recently, Kagame tweeted himself from his own Twitter account, at Paul Kagame, which is a separate Twitter handle from the official account of the Office of the President. Second, were his frequency of tweets and their style or tone, with their exclamation points, abbreviations, and numbers impersonating words which resemble the language more suitable for texting among teens than for an elected official. Third was the candor of Kagame's tweets and his decisions to directly engage his supporters and, crucially, his critics. Finally, as a result, because Kagame manages to represent an ideal part for political engagement in the digital age, he also simultaneously discredits himself. And I don't have time now, but there's a number of instances where Paul Kagame both kind of engaged with some of his critics, particularly British critics, and at the same time, he would use bots to engage with people by trying to criticize them. There's two other people that I want to mention just quickly in passing. Oh, I should have put that up earlier, but I can move on. This is an example from Tanzania where John Magufuli, who's the new president of Tanzania, when he came to power, I don't know how many people know about this, but he implemented a number of sort of cost-cutting measures. He refused to spend money on inauguration, and so a hashtag developed called "What would Magufuli do?" Where people would say, like, if I have a wedding, what would Magufuli do? He would not have a reception. The other instance is this sort of thing became very, very common. This is Morgan Tsvangirai, who is the opposition leader in Zimbabwe. And after a while, he was on Twitter for a while, he got off Twitter, and then this is him sort of announcing, hey, I have no choice but to come back onto Twitter. While the actions of Kagame and these other African leaders, or the way that citizens engage with them, may be interesting for how African governments engage in political discourse online, more interesting for me are the implications of a number of other developments. The first of this is the emergence of sites based outside the African continent, but which have a sort of very direct political implication at home. So one of these is Sahara Reporters. I'm going to not say much about them. What makes them interesting is that they set the news agenda within Nigeria while being based in New York City, just on 29th Street. And it's that fact that they're outside Nigeria that makes them interesting. And then I'm going to move on quickly because time's going to jump ahead of me. Okay. So secondly, there is the Kenyan writer Binyavanga Wenana. Now, Binyavanga is no stranger for his output, both offline and online. In 2005, of course, many of you know, he published the now legendary essay in Granta, How to Write About Africa. And in 2011, he brought out a memoir, One Day I Will Write About This Place. Both were critically acclaimed. In January 2014, Binyavanga came out as a gay man, and he did so crucially online. Now, this represented an interesting moment for African digital cultures, and the example is also somewhat self-indulgent. On Binyavanga's 43rd birthday on Saturday, 18 January 2014, he published this essay, I'm a Homosexual Mum, calling it the lost chapter of his 2011 memoir. The essay was written in the form of a letter to his mother and cut back and forth between different ages, as well as real and imagined memories. As we learned from the piece, he never actually told his late mother, who passed away a few years before this, that he was gay. Over the next day or so, Wainaina and his team also put out a series of videos online in which he expanded on his reasons for coming out, as well as opined on a range of other topics, a sort of video manifesto. But it was this essay that became viral, and it was reported by most mainstream Western media and also in African media, both print, television, online, especially in Kenya, in Nairobi, the capital of Kenya, where Binyavanga is from, and where he resurfaced on TV chat shows a few days later. Now, the attention didn't surprise anyone. The publication of I'm a Homosexual Mum coincided with a fierce debate and a stifling legal environment for gay people in a number of African countries. But what interests me here is how I'm a Homosexual Mum entered our media worlds. It was first posted on 2 small African websites before it was picked up and reported by mainstream media. These websites were the Cape Town-based arts and culture magazine Chimurenga Chronic, and another small website, Africa is a Country. That's the self-indulgent part. Now, this may have surprised many. Of course, for me, it was satisfying to find major media referencing Africa as a country as the primary source for the essay in subsequent coverage. But there was an important rationale behind the decision, as Binyavanga would explain in an interview on American public radio a few days later. And I quote, I'm a writer and I'm an imaginative person, and I think I kind of had a feeling, having been in the media before, that the media kinds of deals in sort of, nice things, but bullet points. Quote, in the heart of the gay homophobia darkness in Africa, Binyavanga writes, or, quote, Binyavanga explains how homophobia in Africa works. So it was very important to me at first. I didn't want the story published in the New Yorker or in some magazine abroad or anything. I wanted to put it out for people to share. I wanted to generate a conversation among Africans, just talk around issues in a certain way. So what we have here is Binyavanga wanting us to imagine for a moment that if there was no Africa as a country and no Chimurenga Chronic, then the announcement would have been made in a Western mainstream media outlet, and the way it would have played out is that opponents of gay rights on the continent would have seen him in a Western media outlet and then would have used that to discredit him as they usually do, that homosexuality is a Western thing, that he is Western sponsored, and so they would just easily dismiss it. Now, some may argue that all these examples that I'm using is not new, it's just in a different form. Think how Kagame's actions resemble that of Kwame Nkrumah in assailing the West. Secondly, think how Chinua Achebe's 1977 takedown of Heart of Darkness reminds us of Binyavanga's many interventions, and how all that dissident radio broadcasting from London, Paris, or Cairo, like the Voice of Algeria, gets updated as Sahara Reporters. But I think there is definitely something different about what's happening today. For one, there's clearly more of it. Two, it's harder to monopolize. And three, especially regular people have access to it. The results are online spaces where Africa's present and future gets worked out in very contradictory, complicated, and messy terms. Also, the bulk of examples I've mentioned here engage in elite politics. Paul Kagame's Twitter account for a long time was about his perceived Western enemies with their sureties. Binyavanga, while he rejects the Afropolitan label and bridges the divide between mass and elite audiences, or Kenyan audiences, and his followers and admirers in the West, has emerged as one of the spokespersons of sort for the grievances of this new wave of mobile, highly educated African migrants. And this you can also say for Chimamanda Adichie or Teju Cole. As for the work of Sahara Reporters, it is organized around familiar ideas about the press and press freedom, corruption, and good governance. Incidentally, the examples referred in this talk are also overwhelmingly male. Now, this is not a function of selection bias, but I think this is also about kind of a criticism about the nature of the public sphere. And I'm going to close in a minute. What about those Africans outside of how we typically conceive of power? And here I'll conclude with reference to just sort of in passing to some examples. First, I think we can't underestimate the extent to which irreverent youth culture, both by ordinary Africans on the continent and in the diaspora, both legal, illegal, formal political, in taking the form of sort of formal political protest, or just informal people producing videos out of their living room, or the famous Pranking My African Dad, or Clifford Owuzo, who turns everything to song, that these things are important in creating, they have real effects, and they create a certain kind of African modernity. Finally, I think we need to also pay attention to media produced by the variant of evangelical Christianity that's exported from parts of West Africa, particularly Nigeria, to the West, and then another variant in increasingly smaller countries like Zimbabwe or Zambia to other parts of Southern Africa. These churches come with their own media and political superstars, men like Nigerian televangelist T.B. Joshua, whose political power seldom gets written about in mainstream Western press, despite his proximity to African presidents and business leaders, and whose YouTube video hits numbers in the millions, and whose followers spread his brand of Nigerian evangelical Christianity to other parts, as I said, to parts of the West, but also transform physically the inner cities of Western capitals. Online, the followers of these pastors vigorously defend their leaders and their churches below the YouTube videos and in comments on websites. And in conclusion then, it is they, I would argue, more than Kagame, Wainaina, and the Afropolitans who increasingly come to determine the outlines of how Africa enters and operates in the global public sphere, and who have thus far, and who we have thus far failed to make sense of adequately or engage with properly. Thank you. Okay.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Akin Adeshokon. I want to quickly thank the organizers of this conference, quite imaginative conference, for asking me to be part of it. I appreciate it deeply, and I'll try to repay that privilege by trying to stay close to time. I'll be speaking today about the visual critique of the problem of power shortage in Lagos, which is one of a series of genres through which I try to conceptually grasp the relationships between planning and infrastructural challenges and the sensorial perception of daily life in Lagos. The spirit in which I'm talking actually sort of goes against the grain of the celebratory impulse of the African city as the site of the kind of invention and imagination that could serve as a model for urbanism for contemporary global south, or for that matter, the world at large. Because for all the salutary aspects of positivist scholarship about new media technology and the visible evidence that cities outside of the Western Hemisphere have much to contribute to general theories of urban change, it seems to me that a lot is still missing from the analysis, and the most consequential of these absences is the need to develop differentiated accounts. Okay, differentiated accounts. I won't say case studies because that's actually a bit problematic, but the fact that we need to sort of think as exhaustively as possible about how to really think about urbanism in terms of differentiation within a particular context, even a context as singular as Lagos itself, so to speak. So if a general theory of African city, or of the global southern city for that matter, is to become feasible, I think it will have to proceed by marshalling disciplinary and generic tendencies that exist in excess of urbanism. So because more than planning, more than systematic planning, I think in a place like Lagos, scheming seems to give a realistic idea of what passes for decisions about infrastructures. The title of my talk is Problem Has Changed Names. It is the satirical fleshing out of PHCN, which stands for Power Holding Corporation of Nigeria, the name of the official provider of electricity in Nigeria until very recently, before it was privatized in 2000 and, what do I press? How do I go? Down, right? Okay, that's a cartoon that really sort of shows. I mean, for those who are familiar with Nigeria, that's actually one of the series of names. Just as electricity is inconsistent, there are inconsistencies also at the level of names. I mean, it's often known as NEPA, which stands for National Electric Power Authority. Well, of course, Nigerians talk about it as NEPA, never expect power always. Then it was privatized as PLC, so people turned it to Nepilepsy. And then when the so-called real power policy was formulated in 2006, it became NEP, and people started saying ineptitude. So I thought that was interesting. These practices may be popular as responses to the serial naming of Nigeria's electricity bureaucracy, which is itself indicative of the complex problem of corruption, uncoordinated planning, and non-productive accumulation. I'm a bit iffy about non-productive accumulation because I think it's productive in a non-normative way, which may be a problematic issue, but it's actually important to recognize that, which characterizes contemporary Nigeria. They are funny, inventive, and therapeutic, and they represent the story of power shortage in Lagos as more than another episode in the narrative pattern of planetary inequality, according to which only 6 African countries provide electricity to more than 50% of their population. And Canada generates more electricity than all of sub-Saharan Africa. That's according to The Economist earlier this year. But they do not fully convey the sense of crisis and infrastructural failure that bureaucracy faces. According to official statistics in Nigeria, as recently as 2013, Nigerians were spending approximately £13 billion annually running private generators. The year before that, in 2012, a Lagos newspaper reported that about 60 million Nigerians owned generators. And that figure, most people consider inaccurate or grossly underestimated. This crisis actually becomes most palpable, oddly enough, at the moment when it seems to be receding, and often momentarily, And for the purpose of this short presentation, I'll speak to the photography of the Nigerian photographer Uche James Iroha, who had a show in 2014 called Power and Powers. Iroha says that in the exhibition, he wanted to articulate what he felt, quote, at a time in 2012, when suddenly I realized that there was steady light, that is electricity, and that realization created a sense of crisis, end of quote. The exhibit showcases a collection of images that explore the dark and unprogressive romance between political power and electricity in artistic and electric power distribution in Nigeria. James Iroha conceives of this response in artistic terms as a process of what he calls memorialization of NEPA, a reality which no longer exists considering the name changes, but also ever present in consciousness as metonymy for power shortage. There's a paradox here. We have memorialization through art. It becomes feasible when nothing, names, electricity supply, is guaranteed to last. But the value of the art thus produced is hard to determine for reasons inseparable from the conditions of possibility. I mean, the story he tells is that at the time that the show was running, the Reuters, the news agency, actually came to the show, and what they were interested in was filming the generator that the gallery owner was using to power the show itself. James Iroha's compositional methods in these photographs is to deploy all the material objects of electricity industry, wires, cables, poles, meters, and those of the generator cartel in its rogue substitutes, as well as the inchoate but unbridled social unconscious, their long interplay as seeded in the population to speak to an intractable infrastructural problems. All of these have titles. Actually, I think this is called Shackled. This is an image of a person whose leg is shackled to a generator. Then this is called umbilical cord. And this is is also called shackled to. I find it to be interesting because, of course, I mean, the aesthetic of photography, of course, it makes the idea of black and white quite fitting, because it's obviously in service of the aesthetic principle of photography as art. But the obvious is easy to miss on another level. The play on these complementary hues of black and white as constitutive of darkness and light. The use of all male models, especially in this image, including himself somewhere. I think Uche himself is somewhere around here. How do you do this? Anyway, I think it's the second person from the left here, the taller guy there. But the byproduct is of a higher quality than a film still, since the initial staging itself was a means to the end of producing what looks like a byproduct. The perspective from which the photographs are framed is direct and frontal, which he explains an attempt to actually confront the problem of power shortage. And it's often, the artist has explained this signal feature of his work as a way of mirroring back to African society, especially the most important resource that we have, human capital, as human beings, as people who are required to solve their problems. Since I'm running out of time, and as I said, I really do not want to take, I don't want to go beyond time. I want to quickly just read some general conclusion, which I conceive of as some speculative ideas about the points I made at the beginning. That not all aspects of a case study or a differentiated account are as problematic as infrastructural planning. And even the different areas of infrastructure are not uniformly consequential in the manner of power shortage, as I've spoken about it here. There's a reason that the problems of transportation that have resulted in small-scale operations in mobility, like Okada, Keke Marwa, Napep, the tricycles, do not evince criticism on the scale of power shortage in Nigeria, but are often approached in the spirit of that the cinematic culture, Nollywood, has stamped its authority on global consciousness, or that the Nigerian entrepreneurs have reimagined the concept of fast food in a manner the American model did not anticipate. A theoretical issue, it seems to me, resides in the conflict between the notion of the African city, which implies difference of scale, or the kind, or which implies difference of scale or kind on the basis of cultural particularity, and the colonial capital, which implies a generalized Western model of rationality. Claims by scholars of contemporary African urbanism, such as Rem Koolhaas, Edgar Pietes, who is present company here, Abdul Malik Simon, Philip de Beck, that such places as Lagos represent the future of the city, or city of the future, have to be more closely examined and on a case-by-case basis. There's not as yet a conceptual agreement about Lagos, not to talk about West Africa and still less about the African city. But that is because, as Pietes himself argued, urbanism is still at a very formative stage on the African continent. There's no doubt that the post-colonial global southern template represents a theoretical option that was hardly available 3 decades ago, when the tricontinental frame put political solidarity at the center of theoretical concern. Additionally, the mere fact of a growing body of scholarship on African cities presents us with grounds for analysis and further critique. Yet, it is important to try to understand the differences between the African city as a geographical fact and as an ideological phrase. Thank you.
Now we have Justin Moore giving some comments. Justin is a designer at the New York Department of Public Planning.
Going to join me here?
Do you want to come and sit back up?
Yeah. All right. So first I want to thank, obviously, Columbia, GSAPP, our Dean, and Mpo, Mario, and Mabel for convening this event. This is rare that we have these conversations and sorts of convenings in spaces like these. And, you know, I'm one of the, I call myself a pracademic, right? So I work, you know, in the real business of making cities in New York City's government, but also really find it important to have these conversations and be a part of the work of the school. And I would say sort of the real talk is that these ideas, sharing of knowledge that we have here is a big part of why the problem that Professor Frampton raised this morning, right? The seeming lack of inability for us to make cities. The cities have changed, but we don't seem to have the tools and the conversations to really do it in a productive way anymore. And it's a big blind spot, and I think this conversation is a big part of that. And another kind of thing with Sean's talk, I think this idea of kind of media, social media, and this question of archive that has kept coming up, right? Where do we learn how to make cities, and where is that knowledge held is obviously here, but it's also more and more in these other and alternative spaces, online, in the phone, on Twitter, and there's really some power in that, and seeing this conversation evolve is important. So onto our panel's topic of social infrastructures. You know, I think it's a big distinction that Brian introduced, this sort of physical infrastructure, the way we traditionally think about infrastructure, and the social or network version of infrastructure and what that means. And very recently here in New York City, we had a very public scrimmage in the New York Times about New York City's third water tunnel. I don't know how many of you saw that, but you know, the idea of the very forward-thinking building of the city and something like its critical infrastructure of water being sort of played out in this very public conversation that everyone is sort of engaging and developing what the social part of the infrastructure is, and really asking these sort of basic questions for what makes a city and how is it sort of determined. And so this leads to, I think, some very basic questions that all of these talks are getting to, which is very simply, what is the city for? Who is the city for? And what does the city need, right? And I think all of these presentations have unpacked the sort of the social and physical aspects of that, but also communications, economy that are really missing in a lot of our cities today. So these are the basic questions that impact, at the very individual level, sort of the child on the street, up to the sort of the level of public infrastructure, the energy systems, but also the sort of national and global conversation, right? What is our nation, right? How is it imagined? How is it understood so that people can participate in those structures, right? My family, my community, my nation, and really thinking about those components, and that is really the work of, people like us, designers, planners, thinkers that are trying to promote the city. And I think in a lot of ways that has been for such a long time framed, has been talked about a lot today, this Western European way of articulating that, of asking those questions, right? And so other ways in distant memory that the responses to those questions were very different or had a different approach has become weakened or even lost, right? And so a lot of this conversation today, I think, is trying to recover a new narrative, sort of a form of storytelling to start building a new way and a new approach to asking and answering these questions that challenge the canons, the bodies of knowledge that have told us for such a long time how to build a city, which came from, we all know who that comes from, right? So seeing this work and this conversation in all of your presentations, I think it's a simple sort of twist of those questions. Okay, well, what is the African city? Who is the African city for? And what does the African city need? For those of you that follow the global conversations, hashtag African cities matter, right? The sort of insistence on addressing that directly, I think, is an important part of the work. And the idea of collective desires, I think, is also shown in this work. The idea that the people and the places themselves are very critical to sort of manifesting in the answering of these questions, and really how do we measure and define progress in these cities and contexts. So with that, Brian introduced again this question of network and social infrastructure, and with Akin, we had the sort of questioning the cracks, where does it break, where does it fail, and the importance of really addressing that, and people being able to sort of, in a really creative mode of kind of networking and identifying ways to challenge power structures by even the simple act of renaming, right? The figure or power of authority, you rename it and you sort of already are able to challenge something that's much bigger than yourself. And the role that, that's a design process to rename something, right? And that's something that architects, people that imagine cities are complicit in and have some form of power to rewrite narratives through the simple act of naming. Sean's presentation, and full disclosure, I'm a Twitter fanatic. This notion of public sphere and public space really that has really been engaged with this idea of media and thinking about media itself as a form of infrastructure, right? So, the New York water tunnel that I just mentioned, that played out in the media, right? And it had very real effects on how the city is going to allocate its resources. And using that infrastructure as a way to kind of change the traditional structures that challenge power structures in the city. And then Patty's work, really, I think, a very interesting for me anyway, context, because for me it starts to really talk about, the diaspora in a way, right? So the recentering or reorientation of what the African city is and where that's defined and who is a part of that, and focusing the discussion on the people that make the cities itself very directly. And I think a lot of work and research is going into this idea of right to the city, who makes the city, and the idea about the sort of role of participation, the role of storytelling, urban narratives are really a critical piece of that. So I'll wrap by saying that, with that framework, that the African city in a lot of ways is not bound by the continent, right? So we have the African city, here in Brownsville, Brooklyn. The African city is in Ferguson, in the suburban context, and the sort of the challenges and problems that were raised, right? The Flint water crisis is not that different from energy in Lagos, and that, a lot of the ideas that you guys have put forward here with challenging questions of infrastructure, social infrastructure, are really giving us really some food for thought for confronting that issue, and I think it sort of points to the fact that, in some ways, many ways, Black is universal, and that we see that playing out in cities around the world, and that there's the conversation starting here for challenging how that gets built and how there's some form of new empowerment for people changing that.
Thanks for those comments. And before I open it up to questions, I just want to see if the panelists want to respond to the comments or to each other. Just give you a chance. With that, I'll switch around to the audience. Any questions from the audience?
Yes, I do have a question.
Oh, well, 1 second. We'll do him first, and then we'll come to you. We need the microphone.
Okay.
We need the infrastructure of amplification.
Thank you. Thank you for 3 wonderful presentations. I have a question about trying. I would like for us to think beyond this idea, this sort of like romanticized idea that's been repeated here about the number of mobile phones in Africa and all of that. And 2, I guess this would be a question for Sean, but I'm not sure. I mean, I guess for everyone. But which is for us to think about sort of like the differentiations and the materiality that does exist in these immaterialities of the internet, of the digital. And I'm thinking of an article that maybe you read recently about Wikipedia in Angola. I don't know, there was a very interesting article about how Angolans or some Angolans are using Wikipedia. So Wikipedia has a program called Wikipedia Zero, in which you can access Wikipedia for free. And there's a mobile provider in Angola that provides this service. And some people are using the service to share films and media and all these things. And this makes me think of, the forms of materiality and colonialism that are embedded in this sort of like, compartmentalized access to the internet. And now we think about this, in Africa, and to think about what you were talking about and other things.
Before you answer, Sean, let's just collect a few questions and we'll take the second question.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Amanada, and I have to go back to what Justin just said. I'm finishing my very last year for architecture school here at Columbia GSAPP, and this is the first time in 5 years that this topic was ever brought up in an academic institution. So I'm really happy to be here. So my question goes back to the overall topic of today, which is the reorientation of the definition of an African city, and how your presentation and the previous one was really looking at the introduction of different platforms, different infrastructures, and social implication in that sense. And my question is, how will that change the definition of the African city itself and the urban fabric and the dynamics associated with that?
Great, thanks. Do you want to respond?
Oh, I have a loud voice, so I was just gonna. I mean, you know, there's a long. One of the problems when you try to begin to map, like, I mean, the reason I sort of got interested in trying to like figure out like, so what is the African, if there is such a thing, like what does it look like, you know, this African internet, is that it's easy to get caught up, as you said, in this kind of like everybody has a phone. There's a lot of this. The economists who, like, say 5 years ago would say like everything is terrible in Africa suddenly discovers, like, you know, the internet is a wonderful thing and everybody has access to information. So what I was trying to emphasize by singling out the people I talked about was to show that you have some of the same, the access, you know, there are power dynamics at play. Paul Kagame, he operates democratically, globally on the internet. He seems to debate with anybody and all comers, but he's not debating with, say, Rwandans. You know, like that's just at a political level. Then there's a way in which a lot of people, the way that they have cell phones, they have pay as you go. They buy these, and people forget that's the invention of Mo Ibrahim. But you know, where you are basically you're not really using your phone to do all these other things. You're using it just to say call me, or you're using it maybe to transfer money to a relative. So this public sphere that I'm sort of talking about, it doesn't. I'm not romantic. Well, I'm not saying you're suggesting that, but I'm not one of those people who's like, oh, look at this wonderful moment, this flowering. No, I'm actually saying that many of the same inequalities gets reproduced, the same access issues gets reproduced, and it's very much these elites who you know, the Afropolitans, even when they try to break it, including, say, the work that I try to do, and that I would never then claim to say sites like African Country or whatever is representing, if you want, the ordinary man. But what you talking, or woman, what you talking about, the Wikipedia thing in Angola, like, I don't know if people should check it out. I think it was on, I think Motorboard, I think, or Motherboard, yeah, it was the site that had a piece on it. It's basically, similar models exist elsewhere, except it's not online, where people get hard drives, and then they pay somebody for that hard drive, and then they get a whole bunch of film, movies. You buy like genres, like, you know, action movies or thrillers or romance, whatever. So there's other interesting ways in which people engage with the technology. And there's also other things that I did not include, like Sakava in Ghana or 419. You know, it's not everything is like political public sphere, or there's all kinds of other like linkages, that the way that people are engaging. Some guy on 419 is engaging with somebody in Australia or in Scotland or whatever, but they are not included in when we have these kind of discussions. Yeah.
Okay, well, my own take on that would be simply, you know, that, I mean, it's perhaps a bit passé to speak about unequal, what is it called, cultural imperialism or digital divide, but I still think, you know, the fact that, I mean, that these new Nigerian-based publishers, you know, that really publish very interesting fiction. For instance, I'm giving an example, but they actually print in the Middle East, you know, in India and not in Nigeria. You know, I mean, they have Nigerian publishers, so I guess that there is a sense in which that's still reinscribed, if you want, the problem of unequal exchange. Basically, the fact that, you know, the amount of broadband that Nigeria actually has, you know, in terms of really the access itself, that actually allows a country like Nigeria or Kenya, for that matter, to really be able to engage in any of these, is actually of a relatively lower amount to compared to a country like Canada, or even Brazil, for instance. You know, I think those are actually important issues that we have to sort of take on. And I don't know that these are actually problems that can be solved so simply, but they are there, and they are part of our, you know, of our imaginary. And I think you know, part of the challenge of the kind of work we do and the work we inhabit is to really take these two things on at the same time. I think I hope that that's a bit of a contribution to that.
Yeah. Yes, I would like to answer the question of the platforms. I mean, this is a question that we face in our project where we are working with a community and people and representation, and how we engage this platform. And initially we had this kind of idealist idea that this could be an instrument for the community to really negotiate their own space and their own dialogue, not only with the city, but also with tourists, etc., because they're very close to the port. They're about 0.1 kilometers from the port. And when the cruise ships arrived, when they arrive during the cruise ship season, there's a police corps that escorts the tourists, and they cannot enter this neighborhood. So obviously this was a desire that the neighborhood had in being represented also. So yes, our idea is to create a platform that's online and that's a live document of this particular neighborhood, and that people could actually input their own stories and create their own archives of their own neighborhood. But obviously there's issues of representation and who represents them. And as curators, let's say, of this platform, it is an issue that we're not reproducing, and we're not falling to the same problem of representation and representing people. Because our idea is that, yes, everybody has a cell phone and everybody can input their own information into it. So it's a work in progress, but I think that for us, it's important to engage this media that's available to talk about these stories and to give voice. And even in the city itself, I mean, there are a lot of people who are seeing these web documents for the first time, and they're shocked because they live 3 kilometers away and they're not in tune with what is going on so close by. So I don't know if I answered, but yeah.
I just wanted to jump in on that, because partly, both in your scholarly work, all three of you, and also in your more cultural and public intellectual work, you're engaged in forms of activism. And it goes back to Jean-Charles' paper earlier on, this distinction between the informal and the formal. So if you look at something like the gangs, that's an informal response to an issue of necessity to deal with children. But then once it exists, in a sense, it routinizes, it sediments over time, it builds, it creates channels. And then we begin to move, the distinction between the form, it formalizes in that sense. And so then once it formalizes, it becomes a bit more strange, because you're all busy formalizing channels. I mean, the website you're talking about is the beginning of that emergent process. So I was wondering how you see that in your own practices. And then with that, I mean, the distinction of informal and formal is a binary. But then, say, the Pentecostal Church of T.B. Joshua or Tuba as a commercial center means that we have very formalized practices that aren't government regulatory practices but are intensely formalized, that now somewhat sit in between that. And, and even if we think of something like the photographs, the presumption of the photograph is that's a representation and the generator is an infrastructure. But the generator is a representation. I better pass my neighbor. That's what they're called in Nigeria. Because it means I've got one and you haven't. So it's always a representation of wealth. It's also a representation of chaos. So as Lagos becomes a world-class city, it's now trying to ban generators because it prevents Lagos being a world-class city. So, and just as the generator is a representation, the photograph is an infrastructure. It becomes part of the channels that allows a flow of cultural forms. So we have this way in which what's an infrastructure is a bit more recursive as an idea, or a bit more difficult to disentangle. And as all of you are so involved in these sorts of practices, I was just wondering on your thoughts on that.
I mean, I can link it to, so one of the things I just thought about now when I sort of finished speaking was probably one of the more interesting ways in which social media engaged with real politics was in South Africa last year with this movement called Roads Must Fall that then morphed into what's known as Fees Must Fall. So there you had something that generally when people talk about hashtag politics is that you can sort of easily just miss it, is that it's online, that it's irreverent, that it doesn't have a place, that it could be somebody tweeting from New York, about struggle in South Africa. I mean, this was the critique of uprisings in Belarus or in Iran or, But one of the interesting things was in South Africa was like how Roads Must Fall, when the court tried to interdict the students of gathering on a campus, the University of Cape Town listed among the parties the hashtag Roads Must Fall. We're interdicting that hashtag, not the hashtag, but that hashtag movement. So these hashtags became, that they became real movements. I mean, it is true that when you start out with these kind of online politics, there is a kind of informality about it. Like, Africa as a country was like a guy with a Twitter handle and a blog, and then it formalizes itself. After a while, it becomes a magazine, or it starts to produce videos. It wants to do public events. So there is a then it becomes like anything else, like any other formal structure that exists, but at the same time it wants to see itself outside of the political mainstream, and that's sort of something that we struggle with, because we are critiquing the infrastructure that exists and that reproduces like certain ideas about Africa, whether there was that crude version of Coney 2012, or like say the debates between Jeffrey Sachs and Bill Easterly, what about development? And so then at some point we also become part of that politics. And this is what I'm saying, like at the end, I think there is, and Brian's right, like the TB Joshua, it's like a company that produces like, products, interviews, they interview like people when they come around to the church. But then there's fans, believers, who create their own sites, where they take on critics of TV Joshua. There are sites where like TV Joshua is a charlatan, and then there's other people who put up there. They're not acting in the name of the church didn't give them any permission. They just sort of exist alongside the church. I think there's a symbiotic relationship between them and the church, but the relationship is never really defined. Yeah. It's never really clearly defined.
Well, okay. Well, again, I guess that my own take on that, which is actually closer to Sean's, is the idea that it's important. I guess it's just important not to get caught in a complacent way. To really be aware of one's position, of why one is doing any of these things. I mean, a good example I'll give, and maybe doing a bit of PR for them, is Chimorenge. This is something that actually started informally and sort of has remained somehow informal, but it's also a formal structure in a way that's really very imaginative. I think that kind of model is really one that I find to be useful in this sense, that it's really, it has certain precursors in, if you want, African cultures, like the Mbari idea of, women periodically making up houses and sort of renewing things, in a way that environment and needs and one's sense of one's purpose or purposes dictate. I think that's an interesting model that I think of. Well, secondly, also, and I'll say this quite briefly, is the idea that institutions and structures are still very important in ways that are really very important that we cannot underestimate. I mean, I've been part of several initiatives, for instance, like really trying to get manuscripts edited, and it was an attempt to really stop people from sending me manuscripts to read, because that makes it impossible for me to work. So that if you want to push that away, you then create some kind of structure that will be more transparent and more consistent. And so in that kind of situation, we actually also need to formalize things. And my sense of Jean Charles' idea was that actually the distinction that you were drawing at some point between formal and informal actually somehow broke down, because there was a rationality even to the so-called informal structure also. So, yeah.
Any other questions?
Hi, thanks, sir. I enjoyed the presentations. Ken, I've got a very specific curiosity.
Okay.
So last year, I looked at some of the numbers on Lagos.
Okay.
Right? And it seems, so I was really surprised in terms of the speed with which public resources and infrastructural investment has grown in the last 6 to 8 years, intimating this incredible institutional turnaround would be too strong a word, but kind of institutional coherence to produce a certain level of investment and change to the materiality of the city, right? Yeah. But a lot of the stuff that I still hear from a lot of commentators on Lagos is within the trope that you presented as well, okay, right? Of the continual deferral, the absence of investment. So, you know, but if I look at the scale of the city and I look at the numbers that, you know, so one very banal example. The BRT system in Lagos was decided upon a year later to South Africa. It was delivered 3 years before South Africa had the first bus on the road. And it managed to get the price functionality sort of calculus right in a way that meant the system could be expanded tenfold within a very short period of time. Okay. So all of that speaks to very, you know, particular modernist capabilities of Weberian institutional competence. And I then was curious about that and kind of what sits behind it. And there's all these kind of new public management, technocratic introductions and so on that led to better management, blah, 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 blah. But the point is that the public fiscus grew by 1,000% in 6 years, right? So this is incredible, right? It is, I mean, it is absolutely astounding. And also the kind of material transformation of the city in terms of the public spaces, the green spaces, the et cetera, the greening, 500,000 trees, blah, blah, blah. So my curiosity is this, right? One is, what does it do to your take? Okay. And secondly, why are the writers and the thinkers of Lagos kind of in denial about this? It feels like that to me, because it seems that they're still talking about a Lagos of 10 years ago.
Yeah, well, I mean...
sorry. Any more questions? We'll collect a couple. Any more questions out there? Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Yeah. All right. I guess that it's what I said in passing, you know, towards the end of my presentation, that not all these infrastructural problems are the same. There are some that are really on the upscale, and transportation is one of them. And I think the reason why that is really different from problem of electricity is that there is actually in Lagos, especially in terms of the road network, a fairly old and traditional idea of modern planning. You know, that, I mean, Lagos is not as well planned as Abuja, for instance, but in terms of the infrastructure of transportation, there is, and because it's relatively a small place, and there have been several attempts to really develop an integrated water, rail, and land system. You know, so these BRT experiments really fed off that, and that's why I think, in a sense, it took off fairly well. And the reason that electricity hasn't followed that is because, one, it's imagined on a national scale, and so there are problems of, you know, to whom does it fall? Is it the state or the federal government? I mean, problems of transportation is basically a state issue. So, and because the series of governors who have ruled Lagos since 1999 have really had this idea about wanting to deal with the urban problems, mostly, especially problem of transportation, you know, because they found that they couldn't really deal with electricity in the same way. And they also took the headway, and in fact, I mean, the problem of electricity has changed slightly, and that was the crisis that we actually introduced, because now they broke the NEPP down to 18 successor companies, and there are certain areas of Lagos that you go to and there's constant electricity. You know, that's really, you know, a very deliberate attempt, you know, to break things down. Of course, it's privatized, it's not generalized. If you don't live in certain areas of Lagos, if you're not connected to the city hall, the general hospital, which of course are essential institutions, you know, you don't get that. So these are actually problem of scale. And the irony, of course, is that the more this model develops, the more neglected other aspects of lives are.
I think we're going to finish with that. Thank you very much, and let's applaud all that.
We We've now reached the end of the panel discussions. We only have one more discussion left, which is the closing plenary with Professor Mamadou Diouf, Edgar Peterson, and Mabel Wilson. But we're going to take a short 30-minute break, and we will return here where Mabel, Edgar, and Mamadou will give us brief presentations. But in the interim, please do enjoy the exhibition Bibanda, Uganda's Bootleg Cinema, which is curated by Paul Falzone and Marissa Moranyan, which is in the foyer. So what time are we coming back? We'll be back at 5:45. What about the wine? What wine? There's in the foyer, right? Oh, there's wine in the foyer.